Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. There is a mental health crisis going on now, and it centers on teenagers. That's the highest demographic of the population dealing with challenges right now, specifically teenage girls. And he helps people of all ages as a noted psychologist down in Florida in all different ways with relationships, people going through stress and anxiety, but he also works with adolescents, say between the ages of 8 and 13, and then some. And he's back with us right now to go over all of this and see where we're at and what you can do if you are a parent dealing with a child that's having some challenges. Dr. Roger Lavine is on the program. Hey, Roger, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. How are you today, Steve?
I'm good. I'm good. And I'm so thankful that we're able to talk about this today because it's such a big topic and a big challenge. I don't know if it's a byproduct of COVID, social media, or what, but it is what it is that a lot of teens are going through things right now. What issues really start in childhood, um, and then also translate into being a teenager?
Well, it's quite interesting that 75% of all mental health issues actually develop during childhood to teenagehood, because if you think about it, that's when we're doing our development of our brain. We're from
Mhm.
childhood till we're about 20 plus years old. So depending upon what's going on in the environment and in the nutrition and those kinds of things and birth issues, this is where things start. And we really like to catch stuff when they're teenagers because then the mental health issues don't become so deeply rooted.
Hmm.
So up until you're between 8 and 13, that's is when separation anxiety starts manifesting itself, phobias, and you'll start being able to clearly see people who are neurodivergent, like autism or ADHD. By the time they get to the mid-teens, then you'll start seeing things like the eating disorders, um, and beginning of like cannabis use disorders. And then a little later, we'll follow on, you'll start seeing things showing up by the time they're in their early 20s, such as schizophrenia and panic and alcohol use, those kinds of things.
Wow. Um, you you mentioned one thing, eating disorders and mid-teen years. How do you help let's say a parent comes to you and says that they have a child that maybe has image issues, maybe body dysmorphia, maybe not officially diagnosed, not eating well because they're afraid to gain weight. How do you deal with a challenge like that?
Well, body dysmorphia is when a person overemphasizes some kind of body defect. And one of the things, and we've talked about hypnotherapy before, hypnosis is great for perception and eating. So if we catch it early enough, we're very, very successful with hypnosis and hypnotherapy. If
Hmm.
it really ingrains itself, quite often for an eating disorder, they'll need inpatient treatment. It becomes that serious an issue. Again, this is why we want to discuss this today, is that let's catch these things earlier in that progression. If I wanted to be great at math, I would practice math and I would really ingrain multiplication tables, for instance, in my brain, and then I would always remember math. Well, the same thing can happen with something like body dysmorphia or OCD, where this thinking pattern gets practiced over and over as a person ages. So it's a far different problem to tackle at 30 or 40 years old than it is at 15. So if we can catch this stuff early before these mental thought patterns become habit and deeply ingrained, it's a lot easier to deal with and a lot easier on the person for them to retrain their brain.
Hmm. Just going to center for just a moment on what we're talking about in regard to hypnotherapy helping a teen with the challenges that we're discussing. Could be you know body image issues, not eating right, eating disorders. Hypnotherapy. So, double question here. Hypnotherapy, you've said, can be very effective. I mentioned that to somebody about this, and they said yes, but also something else. I don't know if it was RTT or if it was something with eye, some kind of eye modality that uses the eye movement. I'm not sure what that was, but I'd like to get your feeling on that.
Well, there's a bunch of eye desensitization techniques. Probably, um, the most famous is EDMR,
That was it. Yeah.
and the whole thing with uh, eye desensitization techniques, one of the premises there is that it's a trauma that needs to be processed. So, if these are trauma based types of things, then EDMR can be very useful, but it's one of many desensitization techniques. And I think the key with doing therapy, what I do in my first sessions at least, is I kind of do a little sampling of different techniques to find out which resonates with the subconscious of the person I'm dealing with and their philosophy. So some people might be very control oriented, and there you would use more of a CBT, more of a mind body type of approach. And then you have other people who would prefer, hey, just do it to me. I believe this will work. There you get more of the hypnotherapy approach. So you have to use an approach that really fits this person's mind and personality and what they're comfortable with.
And I guess it's all, no matter what, whatever the challenge is, I guess it's challenging in that they have to want to heal. Especially we're talking about teens now today. They have to want to feel better. They have to want to move forward. You're not going to be able to do any kind of modality, hypnotherapy or whatever it might be if they're not open to it. Am I right about that?
Well, I think I think you're right on point that one of the biggest challenges is how do you make the adolescent comfortable that you're not trying to make them something they aren't. One of the biggest issues with teenagers is a certain level of rebelliousness. And
Mm-hmm.
that comes because they're desperately trying to protect their identity or create an identity if they haven't had one yet.
Yep.
And they don't want people defining them, right? So I work with all kinds of patients where I start with a patient that's very reluctant to come to therapy or even talk to a therapist. And we work through a process where they can decide for themselves what they want to change. If the parent is saying, hey, this kid's a problem, fix him for me, that's really a bad way to start therapy.
Yeah. And what you said before, I think resonates in terms of the eating disorders. It's a control thing I've often heard. So if the teenager feels that they haven't found their identity and they need something to control, that would be one of them, right?
Right. And
Uh,
I think it's one of the biggest challenges as a therapist is in that first session building that rapport, that connection. And I would suggest that if one of the biggest tests when you bring your teen to a therapist is to make sure that there was a connection there.
mm,
Um, you can force a kid to go to therapy, but like you say, you're not going to get a lot of gain out of it. A good therapist should be able to move them along at their own pace. Now, I do have a little trouble with parents is because, of course, they bring somebody and they want instant work to get started, not realizing that there's a process to get the person ready for the work. But the short answer to your earlier question is uh, if a person's reluctant to work on something, then that you got to meet them where they are,
yeah.
not just accept that they aren't going to get therapy. I mean, I end up with quite a few of my teenagers, the parents bring them in when they're threatening some kind of self-harm, right? They're having thoughts about self-harm. That's pretty late in the process.
Hmm. And that brings us to the next question. What things should you be looking out for as a parent of a teenager? What should be on your radar?
Well, I think generally their social development kind of can clue you in pretty clearly as to how well they're doing. One of the biggest jobs between 8 and 16 is to develop our personality, our social functioning, and those things. So if you have a child that is socially alienated, isn't picking up on social cues, is questionable friend set or no friend set at all, it's pretty safe to assume, as a minimum, this person needs some work to help them with their social skills, right?
Hmm.
Because it's this being alone that takes any difficulty a human being has and turns it into a mental illness. When I have adults even that show up with depression or serious anxiety disorders, they get serious because the person's alone. So I would start by making sure that my child is developing socially and that those are working out well for him.
Hmm. What about ADHD? It's also a big challenge for a lot of parents. It's often difficult, as I understand it, to diagnose it at the same time. What are some things you should be looking as a parent looking out for, and then where do you go from there?
Well, I think every ADHD client I have, and I have many, many, many of them, and I've seen a lot because that's my specialty.
Okay.
One of the one of the key skills for survival of an ADHD type of client is the ability to BS. So if you have a child who gives you a story instead of results,
Hmm.
or is particularly good at that, who also at the same time doesn't show much interest in initiating tasks and in getting things they're not interested done, is something to be considered. I think people look more at the hyperactivity because they're more concerned about a child's behavior. That's when the school will tell you, hey, go get the kid tested, right? Because of the hyperactivity. I think the underdiagnosed ones are the inattentive type, the ones that
Uh,
have trouble focusing, and also the ones that have a very high IQ. Because if you're very intelligent, you can get away with a lot all the way through grade school, and then all of a sudden it hits you when you get to college. So I get a large number of
well,
college students in that did okay in high school because they could get away with their antics, but they didn't make it when they got to college.
wow. Interesting. Um, you're the first that has ever said that, where it's always the focus on the hyperactivity. The student can't concentrate. They just their mind is all over the place. But you identified the other side, the other type of uh, child student that deals with ADHD, where they're just kind of off to the side and they're not engaging and they're not initiating. When you said the BS thing, do you mean that they have good, if we will, BS skills or not?
Oh, yes, very good. I mean, if you think about it, you're in a situation where you're chronically, as a kid, not delivering what people are expecting to you because in a lot of cases you can't attend or sustain attention. Then you have to find some survival mechanism. So they're the guys that have the best stories, and parents will start uh, getting that vibe, like, here comes another story. And this particularly falls out with ADHD people later in relationships. They get into a relationship and they're so used to telling stories or fabricating stuff that it causes a lot of harm in relationships.
Wow. Interesting. You've got some good insight, doctor. things are logical, um, and they come clear. Like as you're because it is, I understand what you're saying. I'm just going to say I understand what you're saying in terms of um, that being the other type of ADHD that we see. How about some of the other challenges that kids go through that we should be mindful of, or how can they be helped? Talking with a therapist.
Well, I think, and it's a very small percentage uh, that I get very concerned about are kids with OCD or what we call prodromal schizophrenia, the phase before they become full-fledged schizophrenics. And
Hmm.
there's a very high success rate working with uh, people in their teenage years with prodromal schizophrenia or with OCD. And I kind of lump them a little bit together because these are the kids that are going to have very intrusive thoughts that are very menacing, uh, often seem a little bizarre and superstitious. You may also notice counting or checking behaviors, but they'll function really well. And it's something that can be hidden pretty well if you're having these thoughts or if you have some OCD tendencies. So what happens in my practice is, somebody shows up, they're 35 or 40, and they've really, really got this deeply ingrained OCD, or now they're a full-blown schizophrenic. Now there's high levels of dysfunction. So if parents can notice, in talking to their kids, if they notice bizarre kinds of thoughts that are very powerful thoughts, they're not just like joking types of thoughts, because you'll find that the person takes them very seriously. They're very real thoughts to them, but to others, they'll seem a little bizarre. Those should
Hmm.
be questioned because prodromal schizophrenia, besides having some of those bizarre thoughts, the child will be very irritable and kind of withdrawn. Um, but it's really important that these kids get seen by somebody and get some help early on before these illnesses really take hold, because they're very, very powerful and dysfunctional as you get older.
So I wonder about this. Let's say you have a child that is exhibiting a number of different things. Let's say, go hypothetic here. Um, we talked about eating disorder, so signs that could be a challenge. Anxiety, depression, maybe social anxiety. You have a bunch of things in your mind as a parent that you're looking at. Maybe you're doing therapy. Maybe it's a psychiatrist. Maybe you've, done meds, tried different meds. Um, we've often said here that hypnotherapy is usually the last thing that somebody tries, unfortunately. Um, how would you attack that situation providing hypnotherapy? Or would you, based on what I just told you? Would hypnotherapy be a good starting point and could probably take care of a number of the things because maybe they're all interconnected?
Well, I think before you ever get to a specific technique, whether it's hypnotherapy, CBT, DBT, uh, EDMR, the whole alphabet soup we have in our
Okay,
industry, right?
sure.
I think I think the first thing is to understand a person's story, right? And how is that story unfolding?
Sure.
I think if I get a 17 or 18-year-old kid, right? I look at what should be going on with this person. How do they see themselves, right? Are they seeing themselves as a whole, healthy, effective human being, or are they seeing themselves defectively, right? How's
Hmm.
their identity developing? How's their social identity developing? Do they see themselves as a leader or a follower? Have they got access to their emotions? If we want to figure out when I'm 17 years old, what career am I going to have? I need to have my emotions available for that
Sure.
kind of, right? So it's more important to understand how is this human being's life and story coming together, because uh, what happens is mental illness gets in the way of our story developing the way it should. It's not the other way around, right? It's like if
Mm.
if um, if those things aren't happening, then something's in the way, and we got to figure out what that something is before we start worrying about how to fix it, right? Because we could very well be working on a symptom rather than working on what part of this human being is not developing the way that would be best for them long term.
Well said. Yeah. Especially when there's many different things going on. These are symptoms of a greater challenge. And I guess it's almost as if you're an investigator. You have to get to the heart of the matter to figure out what's causing all this other stuff that's out there.
Yeah. So to answer your question a little more directly, and I wasn't avoiding it, once you look at how a person's stories come together, you kind of understand what's going on in a person's subconscious. What people don't realize is that 95 to 98% of our cognition, our thinking, is below our level of consciousness. How we interact with somebody, for example, we don't consciously think of the interaction that much. We tend just to respond to the other person. Well, where did that interaction program come from? Well, it came from our interactions when we were 8 to 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we get programmed, right? So by understanding what's going on or what's not going on in the subconscious, by knowing the person's story, you're able to then pick the best technique. And one of the reasons hypnotherapy is pretty powerful is, well, particularly with teenagers, a couple of reasons. One is it's kind of gives you direct access to that subconscious. So if they've developed a story in their mind that they're defective and not as significant as somebody else, you can reach that directly through hypnotherapy. And also, teenagers love the adventure of it. It may even be a way to get them to go to a therapist. In other words, they would just like to try it because they're much more open-minded than, say, somebody older. So it can actually be a draw to get them
Yeah.
to therapy in the sense that, hey, would you like to go on a little adventure?
If you can find a teenager that feels that way, that's fantastic. Not all will, just saying. The others will be. But if you've got one like that, what a win. What a total win there.
But
In
well,
your
I have to say, in my experience, you'll find many more that want to be hypnotized than don't in teenagers.
um that being said, based on your experience, and we have talked before about the traumas that we suffered when we were children. Let's say you have a teenager going through a lot. What percentage would you say is a trauma when they were younger, as opposed to it being a mental illness? And of course, we could have a combination of both. Could you give us a little look at that?
Well, I think you probably find that um, 80 to 85% of people that come into therapy later in life, um, they're going to be anxiety or depression, which is all stress related. So a very high percentage of that will either be a classic trauma that people would think about, oh, I was sexually abused or something like that. Not not a big percentage, maybe a third. But what happens is there can be a lack of development in childhood. Say you have totally unemotional or emotionally removed parents. Well, you're not going to develop the skills to handle
Sure.
life situations, right? And it's a different form of trauma. And then there's kind of a gray area around emotional abuse. Not that I want to get into a debate of what emotional abuse is, but um, if I have a very unpredictable parent who may never lay a hand on me, but who's a screamer, right? And I don't know what that parent is capable of, right? As a
Mm,
child, because I have a 7 or 8 year old mind, then even though I didn't suffer physical abuse or sexual abuse or whatever, that fear as a child leaves an impression. Whether we want to call that a trauma or not would be subjective, but it does leave a mark.
In the moment we have left, what I'm getting from you here is that if you have a teen going through something, you need to get help instead of waiting as life goes on, because that one trauma that could have caused a situation now turns into more anxiety and more depression because it wasn't addressed. And it just like proverbial snowball down the hill where it just gets worse and worse and worse. And now they're 38 and now, or even older. And then they have to try and unpack it and deal with it. Right?
You're on the mark. The analogy I always use is I tell people I'm a sailor. If I'm 98% correct with my direction, just a couple degrees off, then by the time I got to Europe, I could miss the whole continent from the US, right? So with most people, they're 98% fine. It's the 1 or 2% where they didn't develop a skill or have a certain notion that over years gets them way off course in life.
Wow. And you are a sailor. Do you take insurance or is it all private pay? I can't recall.
It's all self-pay.
Self-pay. Gotcha. Okay, great. Your website, easy to find. It's your name, right?
Correct. Dr. Lavine, DOCTOR spelled out, LAVINE.com.
So many parents are looking for answers. So many parents are looking for a direction. And it's right here. Everything we've talked about is so impactful, right down to ADHD and some of the insight you provided. Truly, truly, Roger, I appreciate everything today.
Have a great day.
You too.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.